Welcome, everyone. I'm Corby Kummer, Executive Director of Food and Society at the Aspen Institute. Welcome to our third conversation on food justice, a partnership with Share Our Strength, No Kid Hungry. You'll meet our terrific Share Our Strength partner, Elliot Gaskins, at the close of our session. Conversations on Food Justice explores the roots and evolution of the food movement, the intersections of race, class, and health, education, and environmental inequities. Our last two sessions discussed the origins of the food justice movement, including in Oakland, California, which you'll be seeing in just a few moments, and the perceptions and policies that keep people hungry and poor. You can view our past videos along with a summary call to action, because we are an action-oriented series, and various resources on the Food and Society website, also Share Our Strength. We'll be posting that in the chat and sending follow-up email. You'll find it on our website later this week. Today's topic will delve deeper into the connection between health and structural racism and the inequities of our health and food systems that compound negative health outcomes. Before I introduce our moderator, a few housekeeping items. Q&A. We want and have robust Q&A. Please, starting the moment you think of a question, feel free to post it in chat. We've got several wonderfully able moderators and colleagues behind the scenes who will be filtering and keeping track of all the questions. Start early. Get your questions in early, because we're aiming for a really full, active Q&A session, and today's speakers are very interested in having that robust exchange with all of you. Our moderator, it's our moderator and speaker, really. We're very lucky to have Dr. J. Nadine Gracia, the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Trust for America's Health, nonprofit, nonpartisan public health policy, research and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Dr. Gracia has extensive leadership and management experience in federal government, nonprofit sector, professional associations, and academia. She was in the Obama administration as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Minority Health, and at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as Director of the Office of Minority Health and Chief Medical Officer for the Assistant Secretary of Health. She's also a wonderful speaker, full participant in today's conversation, as well as our gracious moderator. A first-generation Haitian American, Dr. Gracia is also active in many civic, professional, and academic organizations. Welcome, and thanks to Nadine, who'll be introducing our two other speakers, and thank all of you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Corby, for that really gracious and kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's such an honor and a pleasure, truly, to participate in and moderate this very important conversation on food justice, and as we explore the critical issue of hunger and health and the devastating impacts of structural racism. You know, having this conversation at a time when our nation is in the midst of the convergence of an unprecedented COVID-19 pandemic, an economic crisis, and a clarion call for racial equity and racial justice, it couldn't be more timely. We have really some esteemed panelists for our conversation today, who I have the pleasure of introducing and having this conversation with. Our first panelist is Tamara Dyson, who is the executive chef and owner of Solely Vegan, LLC. Tamara has a compelling and truly inspiring story of her journey into the restaurant and food industry, which I will ask her to share so that she truly does justice to her personal story. In 2009, Tamara opened a brick and mortar known as Solely Vegan with the goal to launch a vegan food business. And now 12 years later, she has built Solely Vegan into a nationally known brand with 6 locations. And Tamara plans to continue to grow her business while opening the door for franchising, while exploring other areas of the food industry. Our other panelist is Dr. Fred Opie, who is an innovative educator, speaker, author, and the host of the Fred Opie Show. Fred is a professor of history and foodways at Babson College, and his most recent book is Southern Food and Civil Rights, Feeding the Revolution. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine.
Absolutely. And let's get right into this conversation, one that, as I noted, is truly timely and critically important. And I think one where it's helpful to lay a bit of foundation and context. And Fred, maybe if I could start with you in helping to make that connection when we talk about food justice, and here we're talking specifically about hunger and health and the devastating impacts of structural racism. How do we make that connection between structural racism, food, and hunger?
It is interesting to think about one of the most offensive things that someone could do to you. One would be if you reach out your hand and they don't shake your hand, that's offensive. Another one is denying you a seat at the table, whether it be at the breakfast table, lunch table, or the dinner table. And so if you think about the most iconic protests during the civil rights movement, it was the sit-ins at lunch counters. Why was it so important for white supremacists to deny access to people of color, Jews, Catholics, to a lunch counter? Because breaking bread is so important to our culture and our society. So I think it says something about how you feel about an individual or a group's self-worth when you deny them access to food or the ability to sit down and eat together. You also think about some of the historic punishments in human societies, whether it be from the Roman Empire on up, that one of the most often used punishment is to deny somebody bread and water. So there's something about eating, drinking, and the denial of that has to do with what we think about a person or a group's self-worth.
Absolutely. Thank you for that perspective. And you know, in sharing that kind of a story, we recognize the power of storytelling and really understanding these types of structural inequities that have been longstanding, indeed. Tamara, you come with a personal story, a personal journey that I think is really compelling to put a face to what we're describing, and would love to hear a little bit about your personal story and how that then brought you into the food industry and into the restaurant industry itself.
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I come from a very food insecure background. You know, my mother, a single mother of three, I the youngest of three. And, you know, there were times that my mother shared with me only recently, because I only remember, you know, times being hungry or not having anything in the kitchen, that at times we went on the third day without actually eating anything. So, you know, kind of with that being said, I went into the food industry maybe subconsciously, securing food for my family, because that's one thing that I can always provide is food to the community, food for my family. So, I mean, it's helped to shape and structure actually the individual that I am today. I myself used it as a tool to kind of become more powerful, so to speak, in that area of being able to provide, similar to my grandfather, who was able to provide his family the necessary, you know, the needs through hard work. So I applied that.
Excellent. And you did quite a pivot, right? Quite a shift from where you were originally planning your career to go to then moving into food. And I would love for you to touch upon that and how you brought that experience now into the work that you're doing with regards to the work in the food industry itself.
Yeah, definitely. So I was in the medical field prior to launching Solely Vegan, one prerequisite away from nursing school, worked in the specialty department at Marin General Hospital of endoscopy. And one wouldn't kind of imagine that one would complement the other, one industry would complement the other, but I learned extreme efficiencies. And I definitely kind of applied that to my business, and that's allowed me to not only sustain, but thrive. And then even after, you know, COVID hit, you know, and the business was hit so hard financially, I think that I was able to structure my thoughts on, you know, kind of how to rise above my situation, so to speak, but those experiences at Marin General Hospital, working around phenomenal women, powerful women, very confident women, this all helped to shape and mold me to kind of the persistent individual that I am right now in business.
Thank you. Thank you for that inspiring, sharing part of your inspiring story. You know, you both touched upon this essence of, you know, whether it's the deprivation or having that essence of the insecurity of not having food, and would like to have us talk a little bit more about making that connection of, you know, how hunger and poverty, the both short and long-term consequences of that. You know, if we start, for example, with looking at children and the impact of hunger and health, how it leads to chronic stress for children, and that carries forth into adolescence and into adulthood. You know, Fred, could you talk more about that kind of connection and elaborate on hunger and poverty, and the impact of that as it relates to then stress for children and adolescents and beyond, and how that then becomes a cycle, if you will, and we see this not only exacerbation, but a continuation of the inequities in health and well-being?
Well, let me just briefly say that when you do the kind of work I do, and I'm looking at sources of people of African descent long before they arrived in Americas in 1619. So, I'll go back and I'll look at things in Africa, but I'll also spend quite a bit of time, just because of research projects I'm working on or a series in a blog, looking at slave narratives. And one of the most common commentaries in the slave narratives is to be an enslaved person was to experience hunger. It was just a reality of just constantly thinking about what was your next meal. And people don't necessarily realize that it's an economic system. And so owners gave their enslaved people just enough to survive, and they were on their own to do the rest. So there's the constant ingenuity that you see enslaved people involved in creating food to provide for themselves. And also, as Tamara said, you see parents giving food to their children and going without so the children can survive. So that's one thing I wanted to comment on. The other thing I would fast forward many decades later to the work of the Black Panther Party. And so many of us think about the Black Panther Party as a bunch of violent vigilantes, as it were, in the area Tamara's from in Oakland. But keep in mind that one of the most important programs they did was start a free breakfast program. And this is around 1965, 1968. And they would organize the businesses and communities to donate food. And then they would find a local church to offer space and then provide these meals. Because a lot of these kids in these poor neighborhoods, Black, brown, and white kids, they were going to school hungry. And it just affects what you can do in terms of learning. So that was one of the first initiatives of the Black Panther Party. And they talk about just that experience for kids throughout the rest of their life, that giving, that somebody gave to them and they gave back, and that the kids' grades were going up dramatically. Their behavior in school was improving dramatically because they were going in there with a hot meal. I think that's a real important an example of just the importance of fighting hunger, that you can't expect great behavior of kids. You can't expect educational achievement if people are going to school hungry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see that manifesting today, right? With regards to when we think about the impact of hunger and how it's leading then to both not only consequences for children, but further into adolescence and into adulthood. You touched upon it, Fred, with regards to not being able to learn, and when you're constantly thinking about where your next meal is going to come from and feeling hungry. And that we actually also see these connections to the nutritional deficiencies, right? And the chronic stress that comes from hunger. And then that prolonged stress, for example, can then lead to having this prolonged release of stress hormones themselves that can then increase inflammation, increase risk of chronic health conditions, like diabetes and heart disease. And so we see this, and it can be cyclical with regard, intergenerational, right? With regards to the consequences. And I'm sure that the work that you have done was really studied that with regards to seeing this take place intergenerationally with regards to that food insecurity and poverty.
It's just two other quick points I want to make on what you just said. Is number one is that this is a reality. And if you have kids and you look at your kids' just behavior, what happens when the kids get hungry? You know, sometimes you're like, your kid is just going off the hook. What's going on with the kid? And sometimes it's just simple. They are hungry. So there's a certain level of stress that we all experience when we're hungry, and we don't necessarily associate it with hunger until we get something to eat. And then, as my mother would say, we come back to our right mind. That's one point. I think the other part that we see during COVID is the number of children who would take their first meal at school, and now they're doing remote learning, and they don't have access to that. So a lot of communities are scrambling with, how do you do effective remote learning? Well, if the kids aren't getting fed. And then I think the last point is that most people are not aware that it was the Black Panther Party's free breakfast program that motivated, if not shamed, the federal government into starting that program in public schools around the country. It was the Panthers first, the government second.
And so specifically referring to the national school breakfast programs, national school lunch programs, right, which form a critical part of what we consider to be our safety net, right, with regards with regards to food security. Both of you have touched upon the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have all said, and we're all seeing that the pandemic, it did not create the inequities that we're seeing, but it has exposed them. And it is exacerbating those inequities. And certainly we have seen that as it relates to the impact on low-income communities and certainly in communities of color with regards to rates of cases and hospitalizations and deaths that communities of color are disproportionately being impacted. But that also exists in all of the other dimensions as well of what contributes to our health, which is inclusive of food and hunger. And there's even recent data that came out of the Census Bureau that showed that Hispanic adults in particular have higher prevalence of stress because of concerns about not having enough food. Can you talk to me about, with this pandemic, what can we do now with regards to not only addressing the immediate needs for food security and addressing hunger, but taking the pandemic itself and really looking in the long term at how we address these longstanding inequities as it relates to food insecurity and hunger?
Mary, I'm going to defer to you first.
Information. I think that, with the pandemic, it's a lot, difficult structurally speaking to go out there and provide food. And like Fred touched on, the Black Panthers food program, I think something like that, along with information. I think that, we lack information, therefore we lack access to the solutions on kind of how to rise above our situations and then even get out of them. I think that when you're dealing with food insecurity, then you have your thought process is low, everything is low, your self-esteem is low. And so then you think that you're undeserving. I think that offering, just information to these communities so that people understand that you don't have to be a victim of your circumstance, so to speak. There are ways to get out. There are ways to, kind of teach them how to fish, so to speak, as opposed to just, feeding them right now, even though obviously that's important. I'd love to see programs. I mean, I'm a chef. I have a restaurant in Oakland. I'd love to see kind of the chefs form some sort of, organized food distribution, even if it's just like a once a month, or, if we come together kind of as a collective, then it bears a kind of a lighter weight on each individual's shoulder. But honestly, I feed people physically, but I really, really love to just share information. So I talk a lot to kind of the youth You know, given my background, it's something that I had to rely on my thought process in order to get me out along the way. There were books that I read, you know, that I had to kind of go out and seek and then found, but it's just about kind of knowing that there is a solution out there, you know, to actually pursue it. And a lot of the youth, especially if they're dealing with food insecurity, they have no idea that they can overcome their situation. So I think information is so very important.
Now, I think that there's a great deal of value in remembering what people did before us. And as an historian, that's a lot of what I do with my work, is I look at what's going on now and I think, what lessons can we get from history? And I think there are a couple of them. I'm going to give you some from different cultures and or societies. One is from Turkey, that there's an expression that we use here in our country called on the hook, being on the hook for something. And that is when you would go into a bakery in Turkey to buy bread, and the bread would be molded into a circle. You had the option of buying your bread and then buying another piece of bread that would be for people in need. And in the bakery, there literally would be a hook inside the bakery, and you would take that extra bread that you bought, and the baker would put it on the hook. So if somebody without food was coming by, they could come in. They wouldn't even have to ask anybody, do you have anything for me? They could just look at the hook. So I think at the individual level, at the collective level, at the corporation level, what are things we can do to be on the hook? That's one solution. Then there's certainly the examples that we see during FDR's New Deal and some of the programs they did there. I was just looking at images today, and actually the image behind me is one from relief done during the Great Depression, which is look at existing infrastructures within communities, find out what people need, and then get them those, that, you know, whatever that food staple is. But one of the problems that we see during the Great Depression, and I think similarly now, is we have the food. It is a supply chain problem that we have. The food is not getting to the people. So we have an issue in our country, and not just our country, but other countries as well. But our country, we waste a tremendous amount of food. We throw out a tremendous amount of food. We plow under, as farmers, a certain amount of food. We got to come up with ways to identify. And I think the other example I would pull from the Great Depression is, once the United States moved into World War II, we saw places like Ford, the GM plants, they would convert the plants. And we see similarly right now with corporations and business leaders stepping up to the plate to the Biden administration. We know that you're having a problem getting these vaccines out. Let us use our supply chain that we got and is working really well and implement it. I think if corporations could think of a way of using their supply chains that are set up, of a way of getting folks who have plenty of food to the folks who don't have a lot of food, setting up barter systems between states, between counties, and between communities, identifying people in need and coming up with a supply chain that could get there. Probably the last example is very local level, and I want to give a shout out to the Trader Joe Corporation. I, for many years, volunteered with their program called Share. And what they would do is they would pull product off of the shelves as it was about to go bad. And as many of you know, the labels on products have very little to do if the product is actually, it's still edible. So what they would do is pull products off the shelf, and then they would get people at the store like me, volunteers, to come, and we would pick up the food, particularly on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday, and I would deliver it to soup kitchens. I would deliver it to people who are in transition, all kinds of facilities where people needed this type of food. Salvation Army is one of the clients where I would bring things to. It's a tremendous program, and I know a lot of folks are doing this in the food industry. But if you are somebody who's a leader, an HR person in your company, are you letting your employees know that there's a need, whether it's Trader Joe's or another company, for people to go pick up product and deliver it to folks? Is there somebody who is a supply chain genius within your organization that you could help create a way for that food to get to the right people?
something that both of you highlighted was sectors and the importance that it's not just one sector that has to be involved in this issue, right? That this is going to really take a multi-sectoral approach. And the other is that it's at the systems, that there's the individual, but it's also at the systems level, right? That these inequities have been perpetuated over generations. And some of the work that we do, certainly at Trust for America's Health, is looking at these conditions, right? The conditions in which people are born, where they live, where they work, where kids play, as we term them in public health, the social determinants of health, that are these social and economic conditions. And Fred, you just touched upon a place that I was hoping we would go, which is the opportunity that we now have, certainly within the context of the current and new administration, presidential administration, is what do we need to see with regards to systems level change, right? That changes the narrative that it's solely an individual's responsibility with regards to accessing food and addressing issues of hunger, but understanding that these are longstanding structural and systemic issues that actually have to be transformed. Are there things that you are looking for to see with regards to how the administration will address the issues of hunger and nutrition?
One of the ones I was just thinking as you were talking, one of the reasons why the Biden administration, and I would even say the Trump administration, Republicans might have lost the presidential election. They got a lot of people elected to Congress and Senate, and they got a lot of votes out for Trump. Same thing with the Biden administration. And one of the things I know, I have a course I call Food and Politics. And I look at the role of food in politics and retail politics. And one of the ways that you get your candidate elected is you canvass neighborhoods. You go door to door and you knock and find out, are you registered to vote? Have you voted yet? Can we get you right to the polls? What if we took that same canvassing strategy to find out who is dealing with food inequities and make sure, are you okay? The seniors in your neighborhood, are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you have anything in surplus that you would like to donate that's canned and perishable that we could pass on to somebody else? The canvassing strategy can be used more than just winning campaigns.
Tamara, did you have some thoughts there with regards to what you would like to see with regards to just some of the transformation and changes in systems that can really help to address some of these structural inequities?
Yeah, I think that what Fred said was lovely. I think just kind of holding everybody accountable. I like kind of the thought process behind being on the hook. I think that, we just need to check in. We need to check in and make sure, our neighbors are okay, that our community is okay, and kind of how to logistically structure that is a conversation that needs to be held. But I think all of us should be held accountable.
Something that we also are seeing, is actually this paradox between hunger and food insecurity and obesity. And that we are dealing with an obesity epidemic, and yet at the same time are also seeing this crisis of food insecurity and hunger. And in a report we just released last year, dealt with the issue of food insecurity in the context of the nation's state of obesity. Fred, might you talk to us about explaining that understanding of how are we actually having a paradox of both hunger and obesity that is also disproportionately impacting communities of color and low-income communities?
I think it's twofold. First of all, I think you have to go back to a term I heard one person say. There's different ways of saying it, but food apartheid, which is you don't have grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods. I did my PhD at Syracuse University, had family there, and I noticed when I went there as an undergrad, and then I came back for graduate school almost a decade later, and I was amazed at the number of grocery stores that closed up in low-income areas. So what do people in those low-income areas have in terms of accessing food? And particularly, not only are the groceries closed, but when you have budget cuts in a city, then you have bus routes closed. And if you want to get to a decent grocery store, you got to go out to the suburbs. So they have a very limited access to food. And sometimes it's limited to bodegas that don't necessarily have the healthiest type of foods in those bodegas. So people are consuming things that are high in fat, high in sugar, highly processed, and you're stressed out because of your economic situation. And I don't think it's any revolutionary information to say, when people are stressed out, they often cope by drinking, they often cope by eating. So there is a duality between not having access to grocery stores, farmers markets, or bus routes that can get you to a place where you can access better food, and then having that stuff that is inexpensive right there at your beck and call at the local corner store.
Absolutely. And that really gets at, you know, that issue around the inequitable conditions that we see, right? And that can be traced back to understanding the history of redlining and how communities, you know, there was racial residential segregation, that there was disinvestment in communities of color. And with that disinvestment also came other limited resources. So to your point, Fred, with regards to not having access to full service grocery stores, but also even the types of foods that are available in communities, and whether they're healthy and nutritious and affordable, and the opportunities that communities have. And so then to being actually utilizing and having a diet that is more of a high caloric, less nutrient diet can actually then, where we see these issues of obesity in communities, that then also increase the risk for these chronic conditions such as diabetes and heart disease and other chronic conditions. And so it's how we also think about how we can address the types of infrastructure that is available in communities, and really bring resources to communities that's equitable, to really ensure that they have an equitable opportunity to reach their full health and potential. You know, Tamara, you know, you talked about in particular with regards to food, because there sometimes can be that tension about food and culture, and that food is such a key part of cultural identity, and in particular when I'm talking about not only hunger but also in thinking about obesity, people say, well, how do I maintain our cultural identity with regards to the types of foods that we eat? Could you share, you know, your perspective with regards to the power of food and respect for cultural identity, and how that actually can really create the healthy and healthful lifestyles and living that communities really all deserve to have?
Yeah, definitely. So my mother, again, single mother of three, and, you know, at times she worked, you know, she held 2 or 3 jobs. During those times in particular, she accessed healthier foods for us, actually. So our snacks were, you know, yogurt and granola, apples and raisins, etc. Other times when she, you know, was not working, this one particular time she had gotten hurt or mugged or something, and she went a while without working. We lived up the street from a Hostess bakery, and that bakery would offer the little cakes and pies for maybe like pennies or 5 cents or something like that. So if you can imagine, a mother of 3 with a couple bucks, we were eating Hostess cakes, you know, and that would feed us over a few days. Other times when we weren't doing well, but we weren't doing that bad, then we would be able to access top ramen, hot dogs, things like that. So all of these unhealthy foods. And actually, I myself, when we had, you know, separated from my mother, is when I actually started gaining weight as a child because of that depression. And again, she made the decision to separate because, you know, my father was doing a little bit better. She thought it was a good decision to leave us kids with him, and it turned out to be, you know, the wrong decision. So we moved from place to place. So again, a decision based off of food insecurity. I went into a depression being without my mother. And so what I would do is I would sneak into the kitchen at night and get cake mix, you know, and I started eating cake mix, you know, at night. And that's when I really kind of first started gaining weight. Prior to that, I didn't really. I think that we were active enough, but definitely the stress component, and then trying to keep culture when you're just trying to feed your kids is almost just non-existent. You're going to do whatever you need to do to just get them fed so that they don't have to go to bed, you know, hungry. My mother, she loved us so much, so I can actually never remember feeling hungry, but I do remember being hungry, if that makes sense. But I think it's just, you know, it's almost non-existent to say, okay, we're going to keep a family, you know, culture. It's not sustainable when you're just trying to feed your kids. So whatever the store, the closest store is offering, then that's what you're gonna buy. And that's just, that's the way it was.
That's right. So, you know, it's how do we make the healthy choice, the available choice, the accessible choice, right? And in your case, as you said, you know, that it was whatever was there that you had available to you, and certainly compounded with that is the stress that you had just even as a child, and imagining those types of conditions. How do we then really work to transform and create the conditions in which everyone really has the opportunity to be able to access, you know, what are healthy and affordable foods, nutritious foods, if you will. You know, we also can look to the role of industry in the sense of the business industry, where we've seen, for example, that even when you look at the targeting and marketing of commercials and for foods, and I see, Fred, you shaking your head that that, you know, there's been surveys and studies that have shown that with regards to some of the less healthy foods, that actually is disproportionately marketed to children of color, as opposed to healthy foods. And so it's, you know, a role can be, for example, as is for lawmakers, you know, Congress and others to actually disincentivize and not provide those types of tax loopholes for businesses to be able to actually market those types of foods to children and adolescents. Are there other, you know, sectors and ways in which you see, for example, even in the corporate and business sectors to be engaged and involved in this? Fred, you pointed to some examples of entities you've worked with.
Just a couple of things I've shared in the chat. Tamara's story about depression, and well, it connects to your question about the relationship between poverty and obesity. One of the best books on that topic is Kaisi Lehman's Heavy. It's a terrific book on that and his battle throughout his life growing up in poverty in Jackson, Mississippi, in that kind of you know, that pendulum of going back and forth with eating, and as it relates to his mental health and the economic situation. And then there is a new book out just on what you were talking about on Mickey D's by one of my colleagues at Georgetown University. Her name is Marcia Chatland. Her book is called Franchise: The Golden Arches in Black America. It's by W.W. Norton. And it's on that actual topic, how Mickey D's has targeted towards low income, urban, African-American communities in their pricing and in the location of their stores. So this is documented history that we're talking about. This is not something where we're just some left-wingers pulling things out of our hat talking about these topics. It's real stuff. Now, I need you to repeat your question, because as I was thinking about those books, I forgot.
Well, actually, Fred, you touched upon it, which was the notion, which was indeed the issue that, you know, within the corporate sector, business sector, all the sectors having a role to play, but in particular that we've seen that marketing of these unhealthy foods and drinks, sugary drinks, et cetera, disproportionately marketed to children of color. And so other strategies that we can have to be able to address those other types of systemic issues where the exposure to these unhealthy foods even starts as early as childhood as well.
You know, we have to be vigilant as parents, as educators. Tamara talked about this. We have to feed people, but more importantly, I think we have to educate people. You know, I am constantly talking about this through the work of Michael Pollan. He's got this great part in one of his books where he talks about, like 7 types of food. And one of the things is, how do you know it's real food? If it don't look like real food, it's not real food. He's got just like these 7 things. I'll see if I can find it before we get off and share it in the chat. But a lot of us, we really have gotten so far away from real food. And we're consuming things because it's fast and easy, or it makes us feel full for the moment. But in the long run, what are we doing? And wealthy, wise people make decisions not on tomorrow, not on next year. It's 5 to 10 years.
Yep.
And if we took that same paradigm for eating and thought about what this thing I'm about to drink or put in my body, what's the 5 to 10 year investment I'm making or deficit I'm making by this decision? It is that critical that we teach people how to be what I would call food literate.
Thank you for that, Fred. Let's move now into some audience Q&A. We've got several questions coming in, and it's still continuing on this theme with regards to specifically types of foods. And Tamara, this one's for you. It says that soul food is deeply embedded in the fabric of Black culture. Can you talk about how you've brought the vegan and soul food movements together to create the healthy options for people?
Yeah, definitely. So, I grew up, my grandfather was from Louisiana. My mother, I'd like to kind of call her the cook of the family. So she would prepare his dishes just so, the sausage, bacon, grits, potatoes, great old Southern meal. But I myself, at the age of 17, turning vegan, and this was just a decision that I made at the time. All of a sudden, just eating meat off of a bone didn't sit well with me. So I made the decision to go vegan when I was about 17, and then really got in the kitchen and started learning to cook when I was 18. My grandfather is the greatest man that I ever known in my life. So I think that he was the major influence on me in terms of that Louisiana culture. And so it was only natural for me to kind of gravitate towards that cuisine. But being a vegan, I had to kind of create my own version of it, so to speak. And learning again, and then talking with the community, and gratefully inspiring people to understand that they don't necessarily need meat to flavor their food. In fact, spices and herbs do it a lot better. And so just kind of creating that organically, and then understanding later that, hey, this is something that I want to show the world.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Fred, I think this question's for you. It says the commodification of sugar is deeply rooted in slavery. It is also killing people of color faster. Tell us about the history of sugar in the United States and the outsized impact it has on communities of color.
Excellent question. By the way, I'm sure Tamara is aware of our colleague, Bryant Terry, who also does vegan soul out in the same area. So there are quite a few people. And then my current project, my writing project, is on a woman named Dr. Alvinia Fulton, who was the nutritionist for Dick Gregory, Muhammad Ali, Bill Walton, like all these people. She was turning them on to the importance of eating well, the vegetarian diet, all these supplements. So in terms of sugar, I always, particularly if I'm talking to a predominantly African-American audience, whether I'm in a church or a community event, one of the things I stress is, if you understood the history of sugar and its relationship to the enslavement of people of African descent in the Atlantic slave trade, you probably would never consume processed white sugar again. You would not mess with it. The history is so insidious. And then you look at it and you look at the maladies that have been wreaking havoc on African American communities, diabetes in particular. It is crazy if you look at your family history, how many of us suffer from diabetes, which is directly related to the African slave trade, which first started with the creation of slave plantations off the island of Africa in a place called Sao Tome. So that's the first place where we see slave plantations, and people see just how much money it makes. So it takes off through Brazil first and then throughout the Caribbean. But we would not be in the Americas of people of African descent if it wasn't for the profits made from sugar. And then to know what doctors are saying for us. Now, so let me just go off on a related tangent, is we just see Tom Brady at age 40 something winning the Super Bowl. I don't even know. You guys probably know if he won the MVP. I don't even know. But if you were to look closely at Tom Brady's diet, he consumes no processed sugar whatsoever. Now, if you look at LeBron James, you're going to see the same thing. These are highly productive, excellent athletes, and their nutritionists have said to them, if you want to excel past your peers, here's some things you could do. I'm a former athlete, and I remember doing the same thing. I wasn't getting playing time, so I said, I got to change any and everything I did. One of the first things I did was give up soft drinks and processed sugar. So there's a relationship that historically, it's almost, to me, I see it like voting. Knowing what I know as an historian, I don't care if it's a local school election, school board election, I have to vote because I know. Knowing what I know about the history of sugar, I can't consume it like that. I just can't do it.
So Fred, if you have a resource too that you can plug into the chat, that would be wonderful, just to,
Okay.
because I know there are, specifically talking about the impact of sugar and it intergenerationally as well.
Sure.
So thank you for sharing that. We're going to try to get to a few more audience Q&A. So I've got one here that says, can you talk more about how organizations can address food insecurity in a culturally responsive way? How do we make sure we're offering culturally responsive options to people? Mary, would you like to try that? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's kind of just, kind of going back to what we said initially is just taking responsibility for our community as individuals, logistically, thinking of a resolution on how to get food to the food insecure. In terms of myself, what I serve the community is accessible in comparison to a lot of other establishments. I try to keep my the prices low so that it is accessible. Use fresh ingredients and best ingredients. I feel partially responsible for a lot of my guests' health, because a lot of them eat with us 2 to 3 to maybe even 4 times a week. So I pay close attention. I don't cut any corners. And I think that we should just all hold each other responsible. What does that look like? Because everybody's independent and everybody has their own way of doing things, but what does that look like to hold all of us responsible for our brothers and sisters and what we serve them, or in any way? I serve food, but how are we all serving each other to make sure that we're all okay?
Excellent.
I think she hit the nail on the head there. So I don't have anything additional to add to it.
So Fred, we've got a question that came from someone who said that this was when you spoke about the civil rights movement and you were making the connections with the civil rights movement, how food can be used to include or exclude people. What more can we as consumers of food do to participate in addressing food insecurity?
I go back to the ideal I just said about, I think of my namesake, Frederick Douglass. A young man came up to him when he was living in DC towards the end of his career. He said, Mr. Douglass, what can I do to help my people? And Douglass paused and he said, agitate, agitate, agitate. And I would add to that, for the question you just asked, is organize, organize, organize. Take it upon yourself as a group, whether it be Knights of Columbus, KFC, a local sports team you coach. Used to be a great community service. If you coach, I coach lacrosse for youth kids. Take the league organization and decide that you are going to canvas the community. Do a food canvas. Organize one. Organize one as an organization. If your company is in one particular city and you got a kind of a large campus and footprint in that community, take it upon yourself to organize a canvas, a food canvas, and find out who is in need of food, who has a surplus, particularly during the winter time. I'd say to everybody, do what you can to start a garden or to help somebody start a garden. And as you produce from that garden, find out people in need that you can help distribute that food throughout that community by coming up. We got some smart people on this Zoom event that come up with a way of creating a digital map of the community and do a monthly campus, and where you find out where the food needs are and where the food surplus is, and a way to distribute that.
All right, we're coming on to our final question for both of you, and I'll also chime in and answer on this question as well, which is, what makes you hopeful? What makes you hopeful? Who'd like to start?
For myself, what makes me hopeful? My experiences that I know that I can share with the youth makes me hopeful, for the future of my community. I love to share, and I was just talking to someone about this book that I read more recently that touched on kind of growing and what success looks like. And to me, success is not necessarily winning the lotto or having someone kind of completely fund my dream, but it's about working hard and building something. And then in that process, kind of building character that I can then go back and teach the youth, not only how I did it, financially, but the core values that help me to succeed. And that's something that I mentor young girls, and I'm very passionate about, again, information.
I'd say as an educator, I am teaching 2 sections of a first-year student course. It's on justice and inequality. And I was thinking about at the end of class, I'm teaching it online, by the way, which I've been doing for a long time. And I'm thinking about the 3 students who came to office hours at the end of the class last night. We talked for about 45 minutes. One is from Massachusetts, the other one's from Atlanta. And the third one, I cannot remember where she's from, but she's originally from Ghana. But when I listen to these 3 students, they are millennials who have their act together. They are passionate about making a difference. And I see young folk like that all the time, that they're like sponges. Once they find somebody who is trying to make a difference, they want to listen, they want to add what they're thinking they can do. And they're just inquisitive, trying to find ways to put this stuff in action. So I see a lot of those type of young folk. I know millennials get a bad rap sometimes, but you're not hanging out with millennials that I'm hanging out with. I see some great folk out there, from my daughter to girls I've coached, young men I've coached, and then the folks who I actually teach at Babson. So I have a lot of hope just because of the examples I've seen out there.
Well, thank you both. And I will quickly say what gives me hope is what I see as the growing recognition and the growing sense of ownership that we all have a role to play in creating a more equitable and just society. That is certainly as it relates to hunger and food insecurity. That's as it relates to access to healthcare and education and our criminal justice system and all of these various conditions that impact our health and well-being as a nation. And my hope is that we will take what I started with, the clarion call for action, in this moment to actually see the transformation and make the transformation happen across generations for a healthier and more equitable country. Now, I know we could continue to have this conversation for hours, and I want to thank again Chef Tamara Dyson and Dr. Fred Opie for an engaging discussion. I'm going to turn it over now to Elliot Gaskins, the Managing Director of Development at Share Our Strength, who is going to close us out. Elliot?
Wow, what a powerful and inspiring conversation. Thank you, Nadine, Tamara, and Fred for sharing your strength today and leading us through this terrific conversation. What is crystal clear from today's discussion is that in order to fully address many of the challenges we are facing, including the hunger crisis, we must come to terms with how health, access to healthcare, and the inequities of our food system compound negative health outcomes, especially in communities of color. We will never solve some of our deepest challenges if we don't fully understand the interconnectedness of this. Stay tuned for our summary to action report, where we'll share some of the great wisdom from today and more information on where you can learn more. We'll include all of the resources that Fred put in the chat. In addition, there were several powerful questions that we just could not get to, and we'll try to answer as many as possible in that summary to action report. We'll also be on the lookout for a brief survey where you'll be able to share some feedback about our food justice series and the reimagining of today's conversation and Share Our Strength, Add Passion and Stir podcast. Finally, as we wrestle with so many things from unprecedented hunger, getting as many people the vaccine as quickly as possible, questions on getting our kids back to school, to the mental health toll the pandemic is taking on all of us, what lies at the center is our own unique ability to make a difference. We all can impact how this country and our communities think about health. I hope this conversation today inspired you to raise your voice for those who cannot. Our futures and our children's futures are riding on this. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.